statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. Welcome back. We're fortunate to have you as our top diplomat as we face so many challenges around the world, whether it's violent extremism or nuclear proliferation, health epidemics or climate change. These are challenges that threaten our security and values, and that demands robust investment in international affairs. That's why the President has put forward a strong international affairs budget, and that's why his proposal deserves the support of Congress. The President's budget would end sequestration, something long overdue, including a 7.7% increase in international affairs spending. Why is this increase so important? The Kaiser Family Foundation reported recently that many Americans believe we spend much more on foreign assistance than we actually do. Here are the facts. International affairs totals just over 1% of our federal budget, and foreign aid accounts for less than 1%. With that narrow sliver of the pie, we're keeping Americans safe, strengthening ties around the world, and promoting American leadership abroad. We're getting a pretty good bang for our buck. Still, we can always be more effective, more efficient, and more focused, and I'd like to mention a few of my questions and concerns. Let me start with institutional and bureaucratic challenges at the State Department. We need a department that can adapt to evolving foreign policy and national security issues. We need diplomats equipped to deal with constantly changing demands. Are we recruiting the best talent? Do our diplomats have the tools and training they need to do their jobs right? I'm curious about how the department will implement the forthcoming recommendations of the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. On our response to the Ebola outbreak, Mr. Secretary, I want to applaud you, the State Department, USAID, and the thousands of heroic Americans who've played such an important role. This crisis has required tremendous resources, and our strategy is working. The situation in West Africa continues to improve, but we must remain vigilant until this scourge has been eliminated. This crisis underscores the need for global health funding. Preventing future epidemics requires investment in research, infrastructure, and personnel. So I'm disappointed by proposed cuts to global health programs dealing with tuberculosis, neglected tropical diseases, and other dangerous illnesses. I'd like to find a way to avoid these cuts and keep giving these programs the resources they need. Turning to Ukraine, I have serious doubts that the Minsk agreement will end this crisis. We've taken a handful of incremental steps, but they have not been enough to get ahead of the crisis or deter further Russian aggression. The United States has a major interest in Europe's stability and security. Decades of American investment is on the line. I know dealing with the Kremlin is delicate, but we must not allow Ukraine to lose more territory or to fail economically. In the Middle East, more than 11 million people have been driven from their homes in Syria, and more than 200,000 have been killed. This crisis has spilled across borders. It's created large-scale vulnerability to sexual assault, child marriage, hunger, and other kinds of abuse and exploitation. The budget prioritizes this humanitarian disaster, but much more needs to be done by both the United States and regional partners. This crisis has been fueled by political instability in Iraq and Syria. The new Iraqi Prime Minister has taken some steps to make Iraq's political system more inclusive, but we remain far from the point at which Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds feel like they have a stake in Iraq's future. The way forward in Syria is even less clear, but we know one thing for certain. That country's future should not include Assad. As you've said, Mr. Secretary, he is a one-man super magnet for terrorism. So while we are going after ISIS or the Islamic State, we should not forget that Assad must go. He cannot be part of a Syria for the future. On that note, I welcome the President's decision to send Congress a request for a new authorization to use military force, AUMF, against ISIS. The President's proposal is a reasonable starting point, and this committee will continue our efforts to review the language and the overall strategy to defeat ISIS. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure we get this right. Briefly on Iran, I've said many times that my preference is a negotiated solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis. However, we're hearing troubling reports on the scale and duration of the program that Iran may be allowed as part of a deal. As you've said many times, Mr. Secretary, no deal is better than a bad deal, and so we must ensure that Iran has no pathway to a nuclear weapon and that any deal we sign is a good deal. And finally, I want to commend the proposed $1.1 billion in funding to address root causes of child migration from Central America. We need to ensure that these resources are targeted towards the most vulnerable communities that the children are coming from across the sub-region. And finally, getting back to Europe and Ukraine and Russia, I really believe that NATO hangs in the balance. I think if Putin continues to push Ukraine around and threaten other countries, and NATO is not a sufficient deterrent, we are sort of sending a word to Putin that we're really a paper tiger. So I wish you would talk about that a little bit, because I really do believe the future of NATO hangs in the balance. 4 countries give 2% of their budget to defense as is required, and that's very, very troubling in terms of NATO. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the Secretary's testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Opening questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I mentioned to you just before the hearing began my concern about a report, it was in yesterday's New York Times, that says negotiators weigh plan to phase out nuclear limits on Iran, and essentially it's saying that we would possibly be would accept a fudging, so to speak, of how many years Iran would be prohibited from these various moves to have a nuclear weapon, whether it would be 10 years, 15 years, so on and so forth. But it essentially would ease limits on Iran's production during the later years of an accord, and saying that by doing that, it would be an attempt to bridge the differences between the two sides over how long an agreement should last. Can you talk about this, because it's very disturbing. Obviously, I believe and others believe that and I know you believe that the longest amount of time preventing Iran from gearing up to have a nuclear weapon is preferable. And if we're sort of fudging it, if those reports are true at the end, it's very concerning. You know, no one here, certainly not you, needs to be told about the threat of Iran, and that Iran having a nuclear weapon would be a game changer. We need to support our ally Israel. Iran is an existential threat to them. And so when I hear that the end portion of this agreement is sort of nebulous, or we're going to be a little cloudy about it, it's very disturbing. So I'd like your response to the report in the New York Times.
Absolutely. Couldn't be a more important topic, and I absolutely welcome the chance to talk about it. I regrettably can't talk about it as much as I would love to talk about it, because we don't have a deal yet. And so I am not going to go into great lengths and detail here for that reason, and I would caution others not to be running around combating a deal that hasn't been made. Secondly, I will say, Mr. Ranking Member, you just said the language you used was we don't want to see a reduction of these measures that might then permit Iran to go build a nuclear weapon. Please understand, there is no reduction at any time that permits Iran to build a nuclear weapon. Iran is forever forbidden from building a nuclear weapon. That is the nature of membership in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they are a member of, and that is the nature of certain responsibilities that you accept in the context of verification and transparency. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that here today, except to say to you that obviously that's got to be adequate. Unlike North Korea, which is not a member of the NPT, Iran has certain obligations that go forever. So don't get lured into believing that because something might change or be reduced with respect to, some component they're allowed to do or install, et cetera. Countries that live by the NPT are permitted to have a peaceful nuclear program. That means they can produce power for their nation with a nuclear plant. Japan has very intrusive inspection, and they enrich and they're engaged in producing fuel and doing their capacity. Now, Iran has already mastered the fuel cycle, folks. They did that a number of years ago. When President George W. Bush was president in 2003, the Bush administration policy was no enrichment. And Iran went from 164 centrifuges to 19,000 that are installed, and there's claims of some others being out there, which were going out. So, you know, they've learned how to enrich. By the way, a different administration had an opportunity to stop them or do something, and they didn't. So we are where we are today. They know how to do the fuel cycle. And the question is going to be, what restraints can you put on that now in a way that guarantees you that you know they're not going to build a nuclear weapon? We've said there are 4 pathways to that nuclear weapon. One is through Fordow, another is through Iraq, the other is through Natanz, and the 4th is through covert. Covert's hard. That's the hardest. So we're now negotiating the methods by which we can show that the 4 paths are cut off. And that they're not cut off, folks, for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. They're cut off forever, for as long as they're living up to the NPT. And you have to build some process of a knowledge base and of a system that gets you there over a period of time. That's what we're trying to do. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not today, I don't want to jeopardize these talks. I don't want to mischaracterize them in any way. They're tough. They're hard. There's some very big issues yet to be resolved. We are not there. But we're not going to debate it on a piecemeal basis, and we certainly don't think it's appropriate to condemn it before everybody knows what it in fact is, if there is an is.
Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you a final question about Ukraine. I believe that the United States should provide Ukraine with defensive weapons. I know that Germany and France have resisted it. I really think that what's happened with Ukraine under the 1994, as you well know, Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons with assurances from the U.S., the UK, China, and Russia that they would be protected. That we haven't, in my opinion, lived up to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum at all. And as I said in my opening remark, I think that the credibility of NATO is hanging in the balance with Putin bullying all the countries around Ukraine. I'm wondering if you can comment on the defensive weapons to Ukraine to help them repel Putin's aggression.
Well, we've sent a lot of different items to Ukraine, actually, over a period of time. We're one of the more significant donors. We've been sending counter-battery radars. We've been sending night vision. We've been sending communications gear, MRAPs. I mean, there's a long list of items that we have sent. And in addition, we've been let me just run through. We got about $118 million we've given in training and equipment, $52 million including body armor, helmets, advanced radios, explosive ordnance disposal robots, rations, first aid kits, supplies, $47 million in protective gear for State Border Guard Service, vehicles, up-armored SUVs, heavy engineering equipment, thermal imaging, monitoring equipment, patrol boats, uniforms, generators. And we've provided training and equipment to 6 companies and headquarters elements, that's about 600 personnel, and Ukrainian National Guard, and there's more. So we've been doing a lot. I think everybody understands that we're not going to be able to do enough under any circumstance, that if Russia decides to match it and surpass it, they're going to be able to do it. Everybody knows that, including President Poroshenko. The debate is whether or not there are some weapons that could be given to them that give them a greater ability to defend themselves in order to prevent the creeping land grabbing that's been taking place, or at least raise the cost. That's a very legitimate discussion. President Obama has not yet made that decision, partly because even yesterday there was a meeting in Paris of the Russian foreign minister, the Ukrainian foreign minister, and the French and German foreign ministers to measure the implementation of Minsk and to see if they can move further. Some weapons have been pulled back, some troops have been pulled back. Obviously, Debaltseve was the site of a continued battle. That's a violation. There have been many violations of the Minsk ceasefire since then. So the measurement now is, are we on a downward track to actually seeing an implementation, or is there now a Mariupol or some other effort that may be taking place which would immediately merit a much more significant response, which is teed up? And that could be very serious next level of sanctions coupled with other choices the President may or may not make.
We go now to Eliana